what can you bring to a situation that would not have been as expected within these conditions? And I think that's an interesting way for a culture to really organize itself when you're looking for coincidences in the world and you respond to your own excitement. When you say something like that, I feel excited because it's like, okay, this is on the right track. I don't know what you would call that, but it feels like a kind of aikido with the world. My experience of what it means to love, I think, is very much aligned with this engaged stance of letting be. And crack, do you know the term, the crack?
The crack? Like C-R-A-C-K? No.
C-R-A-I-C, we spell it in Ireland.
Oh, okay.
If you've ever met an Irish person, you might have. People say, how's the crack? Where's the crack? Who's the crack? It's kind of like, what's the story? What's going on?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Love and Philosophy. This is Andrea Hiott. I'm glad you're here. I'm also excited to bring you this conversation with Mark James, a friend and a fellow seeker and philosopher. He's a cognitive scientist, too, working at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. We had this conversation over a year ago, and at that time he'd been working on the paper Wayshaping, which he's still working on now, but he published the preprint, so it will be coming soon. He's collaborating on that with a lot of very interesting people, such as Mushfiqa Jamaluddin, who also wrote a blog post with Mark that's coming soon on Love and Philosophy about all of this. It's really wonderful. Keep a lookout for it. Also, Dave Snowden, Aisha Belhadi. I think Mike Levin is even on the project. Tom Froese, who's the PI for Mark. It's not private investigator, it's principal investigator, which is just the head of a lab, basically. And I'm going to link to that paper. It's about wayshaping. And you may notice this word way. There's a lot of way philosophies rising. Waymaking is what I talk about here, and we talked about wayfaring with Tim Ingold. Mike Levin is talking about navigation in similar ways, and Mike and I have talked about that or similar topics, I think 3 times now on this podcast. So this conversation is about that in many different ways. We start out talking about synchronicity and relevance realization and developing sensitivities, and then we move into this philosophical realm and start to discuss some work that Mark has been doing for many years about patterns and how those relate to our behavior. Mark and his colleagues put all this together in their paper, and they've been taking issues from complexity and trying to think about them in everyday life and bridging into new behavioral realms. Not an easy project, especially in academia, but one that is very worthy in the sense of really trying to help people make sense of their life and to apply some of these ideas that we talk about in neuroscience and cognitive science to our everyday life, which I know is something a lot of you are interested in. The paper itself has to do with asking, what if it's complexity all the way down? It would take me an hour to try and explain all that here. So I will link to a lot of places where you can read more. You don't need to know any of it to listen to this conversation. As I said, it happened a year ago when we were working out ideas. So it's quite a little inside view, just hearing some things that you can then go and see in the papers in different ways. The paper's coming from the tradition of embodied cognition, phenomenology, ecological dynamics, and of course all these other ideas of complexity. All the stuff you hear talked about here, whether you've heard those specific terms or not, it's all subjects that you've probably heard if you've listened to a couple of episodes. The paper also discusses waymaking, which is the philosophy I've been building. So every episode I talk about some part of this. If you want to know more, just look at the links below. Have a look for sure at Mark's work. There's a lot of wonderful ideas in that paper. Scaffolds and shocks and dynamic structural models and seed habits and stepping stones. It's really crossing a lot of lines in terms of disciplines. So I think there's something for everybody there. He's very welcoming of ideas, and it would be wonderful if you have a look at the paper and think about some of this and see how it relates to you in your own life so that we can find even better ways. This way philosophy that's building here is one that's a common philosophy for everyone. It's not something that's owned. I also want to say thanks to Mark because he tells a lot of personal stories in this episode. We talk about the academic papers, but we also talk about it in the context of real life, and mostly his real life, though I also ramble on about my life a bit too. But I just want to thank Mark for being so open and sharing this. I'm really sure there's something here that someone needs to hear. So I hope you're having a good day, a good evening, a good week, a good month. I hope this is going to be a good year somehow, and that however you're making your way, you are finding ways to live into life that you might not have expected, new sensory experiences, new opportunities for connection, new ways of being at peace with yourself, but excited about being alive, being here. It's really pretty amazing that we're here communicating. Life can get super stressful and it's hard to hold all this in mind, but we can always just take a minute and realize it. You know, every day we can take a minute or two and just realize what it is to be a body, sensing the world. And maybe it'll help us deal with all this other stuff that's so hard sometimes. All right. Thanks for being here. Here we go. Hello, Mark. It's so good to see you. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Me too, absolutely.
Hello, all the way to where are you? Maybe you should tell everyone.
So I'm in Okinawa, which is a Japanese island. I think it's about 400 miles south of the lowest island on the mainland.
Oh, wow.
People know it's famous for a couple of things. It's famous for being the site of some pretty horrendous battles during World War II, which the kind of legacy of remains here today because it's basically a kind of a outpost for the US military in the Pacific. And it's also famous for having the most centenarians in any place in the world.
Is it?
Yeah, so it's one of the blue zones. If there's some relationship between those two things, I can't tell you, but it's a very interesting, complex, beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a kind of subtropical island.
Where are you from and how did you end up there in that place? I'm trying to get a sensory feeling for what it's like there. And I imagine it's different from where you began your path, but is it?
Yeah, it certainly is. The kind of proximal story is that my PI got a position here. My PI is someone called Tom Froese, and he was very influential and still is in the kind of space of embodied cognitive science and in activism in particular. And his work was very influential to my own PhD work, which I guess we'll talk about later. And there was some set of coincidences where he had reviewed a paper and then we ended up meeting at a conference. And then he was telling me about this fantastic new university that had recently opened, and it was high trust funding and all these resources, and it was tucked away on this little island. And he mentioned the island, and I had actually heard about it, having had some interest in the general sphere of health and health interventions and all that kind of stuff. So I'd heard about it from the Blue Zone context. And then when I was coming towards the end of my PhD, I started reaching out and talking to people, and talked to Tom as one of those people. And he asked me to submit something, and we submitted something and got a fellowship, ended up here. So yeah, that's the kind of proximal story. But there was an interesting wrinkle along that path where it was COVID at the time. So me and my friend were chatting a lot during COVID about fermented foods.
Oh.
And everybody at the time was doing, I don't know if you remember, but people got really into making sourdough bread. Do you remember that?
Yeah, so I do remember that. I remember everyone in New York at least making kombucha for some reason. But yeah, the sourdough thing I remember was a thing too.
Yeah, where the stories start to intersect here. But I guess our conversation, I have had for a while some issues with my gut and stuff. So we were talking about fermentation, and he was really getting into making sourdough. And then we were throwing around ideas for like what would be a good business under the context of COVID, and maybe some sort of fermentation store would be like actually really valuable, right? It ticks all the boxes because we're thinking, it speaks to the ecology and it speaks to the health and it speaks to the kind of
do it yourself kind of feeling.
Yeah, the kind of maker, mentality. And I still think it's a nice idea. But one day I had the idea that, I don't know, it just came to mind that it was like some sort of accumulation of ideas, but it was like, maybe we should make like a fermented turmeric tea, right? It was all these things coming together. And I rang him up and I was like, fermented turmeric tea. And I was like, let's go. This is the thing. So he was like, okay, search it, just see if anybody's met it already. So I typed it in and it came up like a local, traditional drink in Okinawa. And I was like,
Oh,
oh, maybe there's something there. So
ha.
I allowed myself to believe that there was some import in that coincidence and then kind of
Yeah.
followed that.
It's a kind of pattern,
Yeah.
isn't it? I mean, do you believe in these kind of signs? I know it's a loaded question because there's no good answer, but I
Yeah.
mean, I feel like we all kind of look at them and take them seriously to some extent. Also, I don't know,
Yeah.
there's these patterns, recurring patterns, and they seem like they're telling us something.
I have believed in them to varying degrees at different stages in my life. And I realize when I'm looking for a sign, right, that often I'll find it. And maybe there's some sense in which, you're also participating in the generation of that sign. That's definitely true.
Once you've focused on something, you see it more often.
Yeah, well, there's a kind of process of relevance realization and, sensitivity towards that which expresses your cares and concerns. And then you become a kind of conduit or a throughput for the types of things that reflect that. So I don't know whether or not I believe in them in the sense of like, is every time something like that happens, is it worth paying attention to? No, but can they be helpful in some way if you're in the right state of mind? I think so, much like a kind of tarot deck or something can be helpful if you approach it in the right way.
That's a good way to say it because it almost just tells us something about what patterns we've been participating in and noticing.
Let me say one thing on the coincidence thing. I think there's a sense of if you experience one of these things and you're excited about it by it, there's something in that excitement that you should pay attention to. We do also experience these a lot of the time and just dismiss them. Right? And like we're happy to dismiss them because maybe they signify or could signify something we're not that we don't find too appealing or something. But actually, this whole discussion, I think, gets into maybe what will be the later parts of our discussion around wayshaping and so on.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
It is developing these sensitivities that is part of that process.
It's also about your awareness, and that gets into the more therapeutic side of things, which we'll come to. But it's interesting to think about all this relative to your work in a way, too, because I mean, one thing we connected on was talking about habits and patterns and things in Heidelberg at a conference that Thomas Fuchs put on. And yeah, so that thesis I really love because you talk about patterns of being together. That's the phrase. I think I say it right. I want to think about patterns of being together and where in your trajectory in your life you started thinking about patterns in that sense. I don't know which one feels like you want to start at first, but
Yeah, it is easiest for me in terms of my academic trajectory to do it in something of a chronological fashion. Actually, just to say, I'm preparing a talk for a unit review, this 5-year unit review. So some of this is kind of fresh in my mind because I've been trying to tell myself the story and ask myself, what is the story, right? And finding myself telling it different every time. But I have some kind of loaded up a little bit.
Good. Think of this as practice too.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we talked a little bit about this at my podcast last time, but like, growing up occupying very different, say, family relationships, friend relationships, even community relationships, always finding myself, say, divided between different types of practices, entertained and, say, drawn towards different types of social norms and cultures, and doing a lot of traveling after I left school, moving around quite a bit and continuing in that exploration. I somewhat started to kind of see myself as this kind of like a kind of large hadron collider for cultures, right? Like I'm just going to mix these things together in me and see what happens. And I think the desire to do that came from an artistic desire to write interesting things and produce interesting music, because that's what I was doing at the time. And I had maybe felt that my upbringing wasn't sufficiently interesting to actually do it without doing all this travel and engagement and all of that kind of thing. And anyway, at some point, I think I started to become more and more interested in, let's say, theory and ideas, and started to recognize, because it wasn't obvious to me. I grew up very rural and not immersed in.
Where were you?
The west of Ireland, County Clare, on a peninsula, right out in a peninsula, in effectively agricultural land between two towns, Kilrush and Kilkee. Very interesting places, which we could talk about. Interesting in their own way, let's say.
Yeah, very interesting settings and very different kind of patterns. But yeah, we did talk
Yeah.
about it. And I thought about it in reading your work. I think about it now too, that you were very interested in music and reading, and you were already finding a lot of different patterns, as we talked about together before, that didn't quite fit in with those patterns there.
Yeah, that's definitely true. You realize that they're going to be, you're telling your story, but you're inviting other people to participate in that story. And there's important parts of my story that are maybe important to larger ongoing stories that maybe I should share. Another challenge as part of that was my sexuality, which was slightly awkward. Let's say I identify as straight, and I still do, and have relationships with women, and I have a female partner. But I was also attracted to trans women, and that wasn't something that was very obvious or easy to navigate, and even to get exposed to, or to meet people.
I was just thinking, how did you even have that experience?
I think it started seeing stuff on TV,
Yeah.
and which it probably does for a lot of people.
And like you
Um,
said, it wakes you up or something. It's kind of bodily. Yeah.
yeah, precisely, right. And then maybe you meet somebody here or there and have that same kind of bodily resonance that maybe you were surprised by somewhat. I think for me at that time, it was very confusing, right? Because in Ireland at that time, there was a kind of a awakening and, acceptance of gay rights, and there was a kind of a referendum around gay marriage. There was a lot of big things in Ireland that kind of led to very radical transformation of that society over the last 20, 30 years. But this was certainly one part of them. And yeah, for me at the time, I didn't feel so much a part of that because I didn't identify as gay as such. But I thought there was something weird going on with me, right? And I think in some way that became, I guess, a lot of the exploration became also intertwined with this sense of, okay, well, what is this thing that's going on? And who am I? What am I? How do I deal with this? And in some sense, I'm still dealing with this. The kind of conversation we're having now is also part of that. And maybe I feel kind of the conversation around this. I mean, there's a lot of conversation around trans rights, and rightly so, and all of that. But people coming out and saying, I'm also part of this conversation is not that common. And I think there's a lot of men in my situation, right, who've not participated in this.
I think it's scary, but why is it scary? Even when you're talking, I'm wondering why did you feel weird about that? In a sense, it's your body just reacting. So we don't feel weird when we, in other situations where our body reacts, we even say, oh, it must be natural and all this. And then, but was it because, of course, we have now this kind of awareness of self, which is also related to your work in a way that you become aware of your own patterns or habits or whatever. But was it that at that age, as a young guy, you just didn't see anyone else having that reaction? Was it something like that? Or what made you feel weird? Or was it people saying this is weird and you thinking, actually, I think it's kind of cool? Or I don't know. Do you remember any?
Yeah. I mean, I can speak to certain incidences, but I think there's a kind of a set of incompatible kind of regulatory demands going on in my body, right? This
Oh, yeah.
one strong attraction and another that doesn't want that to be true, right? That is like, well, if this is true, what do I have to accept into my life, and what does that mean? And like, I'm going to have to divulge this to people, and what does that mean?
So you felt it in your setting that was not going to be an easy thing to divulge.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's true, but then, yeah, if you think about the kind of norms of the place that I was growing up in, I mean, so even there to come out as gay at that time was hard, but there was people doing it, but they were still kind of ostracized and maybe somewhat ostracized. But there was just no discussion around trans people at all at that time.
Okay.
It's a lot easier to have that discussion now, and even to acknowledge, say, my relationship to that. But I do think that, yeah, the kind of set of difficult, incompatible regulatory demands that I was trying to navigate and make sense of, I was curious anyway, and I probably would have done all the traveling regardless. But yeah, I think I've started to become very sensitive to where these kinds of conflicts existed, and maybe where some of the social norms were coming from, and, why do I feel like this about myself in this context? And why do I feel less like this about myself in this other context? And starting to appreciate that, when I am around certain groups for a certain period of time and we interact, that I start to absorb some of the patterns of that group, and not in a disingenuous way necessarily, right? That my accent starts to change, my gait starts to change, my affectations and sensibilities and preferences and all of that starts to change. And trying to understand, okay, well, how much of this is changeable and how much of this is not changeable, right?
Mm-hmm.
What exists within the space of possible change, and what is outside that. And I never really had the sense of wanting to change my sexuality as such, but just had a lot of, say, confusion around it. So yeah, I was traveling around and meeting with all these different people and everything.
Did you go to like Dublin or something, or where was the kind of?
So, the day after I finished school, actually, I went to live in Holland, like literally the following day. So I was
Oh
like, I'm
wow.
going to.
Okay.
And I didn't stay there very long. I intended to go and work there and live there, but I wasn't fit for it. It was too intense. I was comfortable to go back home after about 2 weeks. And then I kind of built back up the courage and tried to move to Holland again and got these tickets through this guy online. Oh, no, not online. It was through the newspaper back then to go and
Oh.
do some. And when the tickets came in the post, there were actually tickets to Germany, not Holland. And I was like,
Oh.
okay, I'm going to Germany. Arrived in Germany, didn't know what I was going to do work-wise. Some guy picked us up at the airport. All I knew was his name was Mark too. So I met this guy, Mark, sat in the back of the car. I was like, okay, what are we doing? And he was like, you're basically doing this landscaping work. So we ended up landscaping for a while. And there's lots of stories to tell. I'll just touch on the beats, but we can come back to any of it if you
Mm-hmm.
want. Spent a few months in Germany, moved around a little bit. And I went to the States, the UK. Eventually, I lived in Spain and Australia.
Was this all doing some kind of work, or was it just work on get the next ticket and this kind of thing?
Yeah, it was all mostly working while I was in those places, but always with the sense of I'm kind of working here just to pay my way and see what this is like and experience some of this.
Did it seem like the patterns you threw yourself into were really different from the ones you'd known before? I'm wondering, like, your expectation of it, how it ended up feeling in terms of the way the setting
Yeah,
felt for you.
yeah, that's a good question. I mean, definitely. There was so much divergence, but I was again, I think I was following this artistic impulse, right? I was trying to find the outer edges of whatever it was that I was capable of and capable of experiencing in some sense. And travel seemed like a kind of a relatively surefire way of doing that in a way that's also, say, relatively safe.
You have to confront yourself when you travel.
Yeah,
Were,
absolutely.
were you writing music and stuff too, and reading and?
Yeah, so writing a lot of songs. I had my guitar all the time, but there was a sense of maybe it goes back to that sense of having grown. I felt I grew up in a kind of boring place. Now I don't think that, but I
Mm.
just couldn't see the kind of charm and the intrigue and mystery of it all. Um, and when I write nowadays, if I write short stories or songs or something, it's very rooted in the place I come from, which is interesting. So yeah, there was another, I guess, a part of me with this artistic kind of aspiration, and I was striving ultimately to be an artist. That was the kind of longer trajectory I was assuming, but I think there was a self-destructive dimension to that too. When I was growing up, I read a lot of work of work by and of people who were probably quite self-destructive, Shane MacGowan or Kurt Cobain, or people who kind of pushed the boundaries for their art and brought something back. And so I kind of embraced some of the tougher dimensions, even of the work, like some of the jobs I worked were really, really difficult, but there was something about it that I could, maybe like a writer, it was all material. It all felt like some sort of material for me. And I think that's gone on to be true, even though, let's say, I'm not an artist. I think it's all philosophical fodder in some sense. And yeah, to kind of bring this back around to where I entered academia, at some point, well, actually, I was living remotely. I'd gone back to study music for a while and songwriting, and then after that, I moved to a remote location to write, and I just stayed there. I was there for a few years, and somebody had stayed with me during that period. She was the first person I encountered who had read a lot of Chomsky and difficult works, and was somehow like acknowledging that type of interest or potential in me, and would share these books with me and everything. Uh, and I started to get excited by ideas. And I think in a sense I always had been, right? All my music had always been super lyrical and oriented around ideas rather than stories, let's say. And even if the stories were sometimes sharing ideas.
Patterns too of searching, there's something about that that's very idea oriented, that the way you've described it so far, you're kind of looking like, why is this like this? You're thinking critically about this in a way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, yeah, so after, when you come back and see your own place anew, right, you also see what the others maybe take for a little bit for granted, or can't see outside of, in a way. And then you can kind of see their construction and how you had been constructed in that way. So I was getting into ideas on one hand, and then I was also doing a lot of, let's say, kind of a contemplative practice. So I was kind of developing this kind of, I was, let's say, always rational, but developing a kind of rational stance or something in that direction, right? But I was also like engaged with a lot of communities around different practices, and I got engaged with one for a period of time. So yeah, it was called Ratu Bagas bioenergy shaking, and it was quite interesting. And you can look it up online. The kind of head of the practice was a guy from Bali, this guy Ratu Bagas. And somehow this practice made its way to Ireland, and there was a few little corners of people doing this practice. It was quite interesting, like ecstatic movement.
Wow.
It looks all a bit wild and scary to anybody who's not an initiate, let's say. Anyway, I got involved in this pretty heavily at the time because I was having my own health struggles too, I would say, at the time. And
with your
there was
stomach
some
and stuff, or with, I mean, it's all related, of course, but
yeah, I think it's all related,
yeah.
but I had a lot of OCD, and living isolated on my own, that got a bit worse. And yeah, my stomach was bad. The interaction between those two, I didn't really know how to look after myself at that time, but I started to get involved in this group. I both really got a lot from it and was uber critical of the way they were constructing knowledge within the group, right? It was just obvious to me how badly they were doing a lot of that. I could really see it, right? I could see somebody enter this space and start to take on the norms in a very kind of prescribed way, and then see things through those norms that they wouldn't have previously seen, or they wouldn't have understood in a certain way. And I could almost watch the kind of a train of people coming through being indoctrinated in some sense. And I don't think, like, it wasn't like a heavily indoctrinal, say, cult or something, but it certainly had some of those dimensions. And yeah, I was a bit frustrated with the desire both to experience this practice and gain some value from it, but also getting frustrated with this very obviously poor thinking, let's say, to put it lightly.
Because you have this, the way you're describing that you were able to kind of, there's a lot of like stepping back. Of course, when you had these kind of bodily feelings that didn't really fit with what the norms you were told were, how, but there's this kind of way in which you're perspective taking, or I don't know. I just wonder how you learned it. I think maybe you just came into the world like that. I don't know, but there's a kind of, because, sometimes we're just all in and we can be reckless just doing the things you're describing, but not quite aware that we're doing that. Or maybe you could be really critical of this organization, like something turns you off about it, even as you really want to be part of it, but not really thinking about it. But it sounds like you already had this kind of, I don't know, any idea where that came from? Or do you remember like always having that? Or was that coming from the travel?
I heard it. There's an Irish-American author, John Patrick Shanley, and he describes himself as a member of the jury who refuses to return with a verdict. And I feel like that's a good characterization of my character. I don't know, to be honest, Andrea. I think like when you say it, and I ask myself, maybe where does it come from? If it is a skill, maybe it comes from Well, my mother used to say foster for short periods children with different types of disabilities when we were
Mm.
very young. So there was
Oh, wow.
always different kids coming through the house for periods of time, and they would all have very different challenges. And I really remember quite distinctly having to kind of learn to reckon with their different characteristics. And like this person is doing this thing which seems wild, and it's not something
Mm-hmm.
I'm experienced before. And then I distinctly remember my mother talking me through these types of situations. This person has this needs, and they're a bit different. And I think maybe some of it comes from there, because I don't remember having it before that situation.
No, that makes a
Certainly,
lot of sense to me because definitely a way as a child or a young person that you start to realize what what we're talking about, that there's so many different ways of being in the world. There's not just one way of being in the world, which we assume, all of us assume the way we are is the way everyone else is up to a point until, maybe we start to read or all these things happen that we're talking about. But I think on a very physical level, I've had people in my life who have different ways of being in the world in the same way that you describe. And you really do have to kind of do exactly what I was saying, take a step back and go, oh, okay, so they're doing this and there's another way of doing it. So actually, thank you for telling me that, because that actually fits very well with that pattern that you of just taking a minute and looking at what's really going on here.
yeah, to be honest, I hadn't really thought about that before. So thank you. That is
Yeah,
part.
no, it's interesting. It's also this individual, because I don't know if you've ever heard me talk about edge work, but it's a kind of thing I was interested in early on. What you kind of said earlier about pushing yourself into new places. I was thinking Hunter S. Thompson when I was a kid, and not really liking him, but he came up with this edge work, or putting yourself in situations where you absolutely must kind of transcend your own abilities,
Yeah.
and that can be very destructive, and it can be very creative, and it's not linear at all. But it's that when you were talking too, there's this individual social thing, which I think is very connected to edge work, where you're kind of pushing yourself out of your normal patterns and places. And it can be too solitary, right? It sounds like because it's scary to do that. When you do start opening to all these other worlds and realizing there are all these other ways to be in the world in different cities or through books or music or relationships, you can start to feel like, who am I and what's the balance? And it's a lot to struggle with. And if you're not part of a community or a group or a good group of friends, which we often aren't if we're just solitary nomadic travelers searching, it can be really hard, and it can be really dangerous even for our health, because if we don't know how to deal with it. So I can really understand how you found that group, which instigated a physical change and also a kind of community. And then also that you would, because you'd had this solitary stuff, be questioning it at the same time. Just throwing that out there. What does that make you think of?
Well, I'm curious about the edge work. So for Thompson, it was in his writing, or like in his experiencing in his journalistic work, or
Yeah.
just every.
He actually uses the word edge work, and he talks about people who know the edge, or you only know where it is if you've gone over it or something. I was never fascinated with Hunter S. Thompson, but when I read that word edge work, I understood it, because uh, a lot of
Mhm.
my own stuff was pushing at what people told me were boundaries, or even my own emotional and physical. Something about working at the edge felt very alive to me. And I was actually a good kid. I wasn't like doing crazy stuff, but more even getting out of or exploring worlds that people around me weren't exploring. And so it wasn't really Hunter S. Thompson so much as that he coined that term, because it was the first time I heard edge work. And for me, that was about that. Other people have used it in other way. There's a psychologist, Stephen Lang, who took up that idea of edge work and wrote about it, which I read back a long time ago too. And then, of course, in complexity science, we have edges and edge work. And there's a lot of different ways people talk about it now, but that he was the one who first said the word that I thought, did it make sense to you, edge work?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the idea you're describing, absolutely. I
Mm.
think in a way, it was maybe my kind of modus operandi for a long time. And I think the challenges that also come with it are familiar to me too. The sense of continuing the search, right, is one challenge, but also not feeling sufficiently rooted anywhere that you can kind of find that ease and comfort and safety. And I think my work, let's say personal work, relational work, interpersonal work in the last few years has been kind of rerouting in some sense. and trying to maintain whatever the kind of insights, principles, dispositions, tendencies that were gathered from the edges, but somehow can now be more productive when they're brought into some sort of coherent integration. And I do think that's very possible. I'm definitely witnessing it as part of my own evolution of my identity, finding kind of root in music again, really. And like I described to you, in some of the affectations of the places in which I grew up, and things as simple as singing in my own accent, which is not something I ever did, right? And like, wow, why did I never do that? And then finding that when I sing in my own accent, another sense of rootedness accompanies that, right? And yeah,
That's
I
very
could talk.
beautiful. That's very beautiful. It just feels like you got to a place where you're at peace with who you are, in a sense, which doesn't mean you've defined who you are, you're some static thing, but I am again projecting my own life, but I rejected a lot of the kind of small townish stuff that I came from. But once I started feeling more comfortable with just my own self, and like I kind of looked at who I was, and then my setting and my childhood and everything, then it looked completely different to me. I don't know if it's similar for you,
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah,
but
yeah.
singing in your own voice, that's really a physical, embodied, powerful, I don't know. There's something really powerful about that.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about that too is it's not that it just comes, right? It has to be, you do have to find it again, or find it for the first time even. Like, it's your own accent and it's your own intonation and it's your own turn of phrase and everything. But there's a sense of kind of ownership and association. And, the word authenticity is difficult, but it's not nothing in some sense. It's
No,
like
no.
it floats around there and we have to engage with it. And there's something, I think, part of that does actually come from like, and maybe this is like tied in some sense to a notion of wisdom or something, but when you move around and you encounter so many different spaces and groups and norms, and you start to kind of sense, okay, which parts of me work in across these situations, which parts of me are more portable and I'm happy to express and I would happily have other people know, and can I be comfortable with those parts of myself? Once you can start to do that more and more, you do start to settle into those parts of yourself, I think, and kind of wear them and express them. And there's something in music or in the constitution of art or in the production of a piece of art in which you're also doing that, right? In a kind of microcosmic way. You're kind of
Hmm.
reaching out into these ideas and possibilities. And, whether it's in the form of rhythm or intonation or words, some sort of accent on your singing, there's some way in which the resonance of that and the resonance of this higher order kind of integration I was talking about start to align. And then that is a kind of like, we talk about finding our voice, right? But I do think that's kind of what it's getting at in some
Hmm.
sense.
Yeah, and this makes me think of your thesis work too, because maybe we can bring it in a little bit. This patterns of being together. I know it's impossible to give a summary of a thesis, but you could maybe help people better understand. But that's the phrase I always remember. And also it's connected to habits, it's connected to embodiment, it's in a philosophical and scientific way, and so as to better understand it. But one thing I wanted to bring up was patterns of being together and patterns of being alone
Mm.
or solitary. Are those, you play with it a lot with the solitary individual thing too, but we tend to think of them as this linear either or. One thing I like a lot about your later work, and we'll get to it with the Wayshaping and all this that's coming now, is you talk about these things as nested and not linear habits. I think you start with Dewey's idea of that, and that's kind of true about patterns of being together too, in terms of where the individual is and where the social is. And if it's more that we're calling it those words depending on what we're trying to kind of understand and assess, rather than it ever actually being only one or the other. You have this great quote, I can't remember who said it, but about being embodied is never a private or something.
Yeah. Okay. So in all of this story we're just telling, right? At some point you have an experience, and I think this experience is common, where you suddenly find yourself presented with, say, two groups of people or two people with whom you have some sort of mutually exclusive history of interaction. And suddenly you can't act in the way that you normally do in front of either because there's some sort of betrayal of the other, right? Like if I do the thing that I normally do with you, it doesn't look good to this other person, and right? And you suddenly find yourself caught. Like, who am I? Who is this? Like, who am I when I'm with those people? Because I never felt weird until this moment, and I always just felt myself. Um, so
Totally. We all
I
know this, but just for example, you have some people who study philosophy and you're a certain way with them, and it's a bit different than the people you might play volleyball with. Could all be the same people, but often in our lives we're in these different groups and you bring them together and it's almost like you feel a kind of dissonance of the patterns or something.
Yes, exactly. One of my favorite experiences. I don't know why I love this so much, but I think it highlights this kind of construction that we've been talking about. So that was the starting point for my PhD, that type of experience, and to say, well, okay, those patterns, let's say it could be higher order conceptual patterns, like people with political beliefs around something or religious convictions, or they could be also like norms of volleyball, right? It could be, say, constructed at different orders of complexity, let's say. So when I was in university and having these experiences and trying to make sense of them and seeing the kind of social constitution of our minds and how we could be drawn into it in interaction, and we could in a way that's maybe not consciously orchestrated, but just through the dynamics of our embodied interaction. Yeah, I started to ask, okay, well, how do we make sense of this? And the kind of existing models that say were derived from cognitive psychology around, say, memory and visuospatial sketchpads and, computational processes that just didn't seem to kind of add up to and capture the types of phenomena that were interesting to me, right? There's something about that interbodily coupling, or that situation that I described, that speaks to an interbodily coupling. Your body is doing it before you even think to engage, and just kind of habituated to the other person in a certain way. So when I did my master's, I eventually came across the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty and his notion of intercorporeality. And this speaks directly to this idea, right? That in some sense, the primacy of our being in the world is a world in which we are with others in a kind of pre-reflective manner, already attuned to them, to us and our interests, as has been shaped through those relationships and so on. Some people have recently written, a philosopher and colleague, Anna Chaunica, with Michael Levin, I believe, have written about in the womb, we're already establishing this kind of a set of, let's say, participatory frames, is what I like to call them, which are these kinds of oscillatory rhythmic dynamics that allow us both to make sense of each other and the world in a way that expresses the fact that I have this relationship to this other person. So the language of intercorporeality, and then let's say the 4E cognitive science, which comes along with coordination dynamics and dynamical systems and complexity theory, and actually kind of starts to help us make sense of this type of stuff in a formal way, I found very appealing. And yeah, my question was, well, can we make sense of this kind of cultural reproduction and production through embodied interaction using these kinds of lenses? And in a sense, that's what I set out to do. But the question about the kind of individual and the social is kind of in the background there. And the story I'm trying to tell in my PhD is to soften these types of divisions, right? And I think there's good reason to do that just for our own, say, being in the world, but also, a lot of political divisions so on kind of organizes around these kind of bifurcations. On the one hand, you have the perfectly responsible, autonomous individual who needs to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and just get their act together. And on the other hand, you have an all-determining system which you can't help but be organized by. Maybe this goes back to my experience again, but my sense is neither of those are entirely correct. And although you are constrained and organized by the systemic dimensions, you also have some modicum of agency, and you can better resource that in ways if you can figure out how it's constructed in those relationships. I don't speak about it much in the thesis, but part of my interest there too was like how, even when I'm apart from these social relationships, is it that I'm organized to see the world in a way that gears me back into the social relationships, right? So I appraise the world and make judgments through a kind of lens, right, or a sense frame, as I call it, that is somehow valuable to me in relationship that I'm not presently acting within. And I think that's very interesting. Because then we can really see the extent to which we're socially constructed, even if we still retain some sort of, I do think we retain some strong sense of agency, but it's very hard to escape or evade that kind of social construction too.
Yeah, agency is a important word in a lot of your work and in all of this, of course. But I want to get kind of messy with this a bit because it's something I often try to figure out how to articulate. Maybe you can articulate it better, but this linearity or this dichotomy that you were just touching on a bit really guides so much. And it's understandable because we are connected, we are the patterns, right? But to kind of develop and survive, our parents call us a name or our caretakers, and they kind of divide us off from that in terms of the way we began to develop our language and the way we interact with this kind of third space of representation, like through language, where your parents begin to call you certain things and your caretakers and your teachers and all these people. And you're sharing all these patterns, but at the same time, you're learning that you need to make your own kind of patterns and other people see you as a certain kind of pattern. And that develops into this solitary feeling or individual, but it's really us just doing the same thing we do in all the other patterns of the world, which is deal with that encounter as best we can. But somehow this one feels special because it does start to develop a kind of agency in the sense that by becoming aware of our own bodies and our thoughts, which aren't separate, we do begin to notice the patterns of ourselves and of the world. And there is this agency there that I think that you're kind of illuminating. But then once we've gotten to that point, we feel separate, because we kind of had to learn that in order to get here. It reminds me a little bit of leaving home to come back to home and know it. There's a similar movement going on there in terms of developing a sense of a solitary self in order to kind of then realize you're not solitary. Maybe that's getting too far out, but what do you think?
I mean, the metaphor with the returning home is fascinating. I think you're onto something there. There might be something to explain. Yeah, that's super interesting. I think there's a sense in which maybe like we can say challenge the kind of boundaries of that, let's say, more atomized self a little bit. True. So, you recognize the individual and you empower them in some way. And maybe this speaks a little bit to my more recent work, but through the recognition of the kind of scaffolding in which that individual is maintained or reproduced, you can start to see that self as, say, dependent on certain kinds of available resources in the environment to be maintained as that self, right? And then I think that has the kind of potential to kind of redistribute the kind of sense of self, even if the sense of agency might even grow in that context, right? The more I understand the extent to which I can resource my own agency through my environment, I both do resource that agency, but also better acknowledge my dependencies on the environment and the extent to which I am interdependent with the scaffoldings there. In a sense, that kind of recognition is where I think some of this discussion starts to enter the kind of conversation around health. I mean, it could be a conversation about art also, or education, or whatever domain within which we seek to navigate, right, to make our way. I just, for my own interests and intrigues, have tended to try and focus these things on questions of health. And I think health is obviously a very broad term, and art and spirituality and all of those other things that I mentioned also can kind of fall under.
The health is connected to all these other things too. It's because we're assessing when we're using all of this language and this space where we're communicating. We're trying to kind of understand and assess things. And so we have to kind of orient which patterns are we looking for, because everything is not linear, right? There's multiple patterns that we're part of at all times. And just by the fact of noticing the pattern, we're in a way kind of we're not freezing it, but we're looking at it in a way that's a little bit different from how it actually is, because it's a process, it's dynamic. I know you like Whitehead a lot, and there's this, ongoing movement which we can't actually ever freeze and study. But through something like looking at the patterns, we can enough, because we look at the statistical regularities and so on and so forth. But to get to health, right? So maybe we can connect to your personal stuff and to the work a bit, because all of this for you, this finding new patterns, learning how to balance and find the refrain and the harmony and all those patterns was a matter of health too, wasn't it? And that's not like there was the health of your body and this. It was all at the same time. But did turning your attention specifically on this idea of health show you some way to look at those patterns differently that was helpful?
I'm hesitant to even start talking because I know I'll
Mhm.
just start rambling in some direction.
This is perfectly great place to ramble, as I've already
Okay,
demonstrated.
so I like to tell stories with this kind of work because, you can read my work and it's technical and abstract, and I try and work a few stories in there because when you're talking about something like health, there is a broader audience that I have in mind and I want people to be able to connect with this stuff. And I don't know if I do a good job of doing that, but I'm working towards doing a better job of doing that. Forgive me for telling stories and so on.
Mark, I think you connect very deeply with people in a way, just in the sense that you've described. You connect with them by being present with them. And this is all about trying to articulate how to kind of narrate that. So stories are actually probably the most helpful thing, just from my point of view.
Okay, well, I'll stop apologizing for myself.
Thank
I
you.
come from a story culture, a culture of apologizers.
Okay,
So,
okay.
uh, so yeah, my own journey around health, let's say, has a few particular threads, some of which I've kind of gestured to. And as you say, it's a broad category and it could include all of these things, but there's maybe some more well-defined elements of that that are more obviously health related. And one is that I've had some sort of chronic health condition for a very long time, not very well understood, and to this day, not very well understood. But basically, on occasion, I would lose the coordination in my body, and it could last up to 3 or 4 days. And it would be quite mild, like a mild ataxia, or, if you see somebody at the end of a marathon struggling to kind of
Hmm.
coordinate their limbs, like a very mild version of that. But if I was taxed with any sort of exercise or doing anything stressful, I would just completely shut down. Actually, can I tell you a funny story?
Yeah, please do. Although that's a very deep thing. I just taking a minute to take it in, because that must have been a lot to go through. But yes, now I'm ready to laugh. Better be funny.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you very much. Feel seen and heard. Thank you. Once we were in Holland, actually, it was late at night and I was in what I call the zone, right? Where I'm in this kind of wobbly space and I can't coordinate very well. And it was very late at night and I was stressed and tired and I just wanted to get home. And we were on a alley, side alley, and walking along this alley, and on the corner were two guys kind of hanging out 5 o'clock in the morning, didn't look super friendly. Anyway, we rounded the corner and they started talking to us, and we just kept walking. And then maybe 50 yards up the road, I noticed that they were following us, and one of them started shouting. And as I said, when I got stressed, my body would just shut down entirely. So as he started shouting and getting closer, my body started slowing down more and more. And
Whoa.
by the time he got to me, I had just like stopped and I had to like just sit on the ground.
I
And
don't know why this is
suddenly,
funny, but okay. It is funny, but it's almost like
suddenly
I'm
this
seeing it in
whole
a cartoonish kind of way, where you need to speed up, but instead you slow down.
yeah, I remember it in a kind of cartoon vision too.
Hmm.
Like by the time he got to me, sitting on the middle of the road had like transformed the situation so much that he couldn't comprehend. And he was like, whoa. It's like, dude, what is going on here? And then the other guy who was with him was kind of trying to continue the robbery, and he's like, fuck's sake, man, can't you see there's something happening here? So he asked me if I needed an ambulance, and he was just like, heroin? It must be heroin. I was like,
Uh,
no, it's
the guy who
coordination.
was probably gonna take your money or whatever asked you if you need an ambulance.
Yeah, there was somehow like this
You
whole.
just switched the whole pattern.
Yeah. I mean,
Hmm.
I find that an interesting story because it speaks to the kinds of things I'm also interested in, right? Like that there are these
Absolutely.
patterns that are
Yeah.
even organizing the robbers on the street, right? But they don't know about it. And if you kind of destabilize the pattern, it also disrupts.
Exactly. I think it's so powerful. I'm really glad you told that story, because I've thought of that a lot, of this And again, it's these dissonance of patterns, or you've talked about frames, or we've mentioned the word scripts. And you also mentioned, I mean, a lot of that terminology tends to get thought of in this traditionally mental way, or we're thinking about our thoughts as scripts. But as you said,
Right.
the body is also, these aren't separate.
Yeah.
This is why I keep pushing at this linearity. The body is engaged in dealing with sensory regularities and scripts. It's how we survive. And it's really fascinating when, I don't know if it comes back to presence and awareness too, but everything does shift if those scripts suddenly get interrupted in the way that you completely interrupted the about to be robbed script. It's
I
fascinating.
think
It's almost like time stops or something.
right, the fact that the body is self-organized within constraints to, say, enact these scripts, right? If the constraints radically shift all of a sudden, it doesn't have the same scaffolding within which to enact that. So, like, you destabilize the scaffolding, you destabilize the kind of structural coupling that is present in the body to express that.
And then you literally changed the person's kind of goal or behavior or sense of self. You don't change it, but everyone's it all changes together, I guess, in the sense that is kind of illustrated by that story. And also which touches on what we've been talking about too, about us being different people in different situations, right? Because that's kind of just a setting of particular patterns that we're all kind of playing out together in a certain way.
Yeah, there was a set of sociologists in the, I think, 70s, 80s who maybe didn't have the same language that we're using right now, but had some sense of the kind of power and almost determining power of these patterns. And they would practice so-called breaching experiments where they would do things a bit like this, right? So they'd go into the store, place a pint of milk on the counter or whatever, and then try and like haggle up, right? Like, no, I want to
Mm.
give you more. Just see what happens. Right? Or
Yeah,
the
that's
students
wonderful.
home to the parents. And
Reminds
like,
me of
I think
Lucius Burckhardt, who I like a lot. It's more with the kind of city work that I think about it, which are also kind of
uh,
scripts in this way. And I think of it a lot with your work, by the way, with patterns and stuff. But that would be another conversation. But yeah, he talks about interventions where you intervene in what people are normally expecting in a city and stuff. And of course, I think there's a lot of art that plays on this too. But it's very fascinating. Also, it makes me think of Fred Cummins, who we should mention, right? Who was your supervisor and yeah, joint speech and certain kinds of joint action and things like this, but also the power of that, but also the power of when that shifts.
yeah. I think there's a, I mean, it's in all cultures, I think, but in Ireland in particular, there's, I don't know if you know this term, the crack. Do you know the term, the crack?
The crack? Like
Yeah.
Crack? No.
Craic, we spell it in Ireland.
Oh,
If
okay.
you've ever met an Irish person, they might have mentioned it to you. But people say, how's the crack? Where's the crack? Who's the crack? It's kind of like, what's the story? What's going on?
Oh, okay.
It derives, from the kind of traditional English word crack, like a crack in a plate or something.
Yeah, I think I
Uh,
got too caught up with Kraken. It's like Karaken. That's what
okay.
came to mind. But anyway, yes. Okay, no, I don't know. Thank you for filling me in on something I didn't know about. Mhm.
So the term is a very commonplace in Ireland nowadays. I think it really, like, it's maybe a bit quaint to say, and Irish people are often stereotyped as kind of being fun, and I don't know if that's a bad thing, right? But like, stereotyped as being the kind of song and dance man, let's say. And it's not altogether untrue, right? I think within our culture we do celebrate that type of thing a lot. But there's a kind of a, speaking of participatory frames and so on, the dominant frame in Ireland really is, let's say, the crack, right? So what can you bring to a situation that would not have been as expected within these conditions? And I think that's an interesting way for a culture to organize. So it's really organize itself around surprising itself, around being adaptive, around any social interaction that might take place can always be improved by the presence of something that you did not expect to take place within that social setting.
That is
And
fascinating. I did not know that. Now I'm trying to think about the history of Ireland. But anyway, okay. Wow.
I think there's, yeah, I mean, these are just my ideas around this. Someone
Mm.
else might disagree entirely, but there's a text recently by an Irish author and journalist, Fintan O'Toole, who's maybe kind of one of the most articulate, say, orators of the contemporary Irish story. And the book is called We Don't Know Ourselves. And in Ireland, we have this phrase like, we got the new television and we didn't know ourselves. Or like, since Marty got his new car, he doesn't know himself. And it kind of speaks to this idea of like, he's been transformed by the curtains or the bathtub or whatever it is, right? And
the guy who sat down in the middle of the street when I was about to.
Yeah, suddenly didn't know ourselves, right? O'Toole kind of speaks to this idea that, the Irish culture, given its history and given it been pulled between Britain and America and having all these allegiances, but also been in kind of its own thing, right? It wasn't part of the Roman Empire. It had a very different kind of version of Christianity rooted in paganism and that kind of thing. Quite a unique culture. But what he kind of characterizes the culture is of being this ability to shift and move and adapt and welcome the surprise and lean into the surprise when it serves it. And I can't help but think that there's something about this idea of the Craic being central to Ireland that's also reflected at this macro scale and how we've kind of navigated our relationship to the world around us.
It resonates when you say it. It really resonates. I mean, having lived in or been in Ireland a bit with my dad when he worked there and stuff, and loving Yeats, and there's a lot of things that you in the history. When you said that, it makes sense. Yeah, there's a pattern.
Yeah. I think there is that pattern, and in a way, it's the kind of pattern I saw manifest in myself too, right? This kind of fragmented, looking for things, whatever.
But it's a kind of superhero-ish thing too, that to be able to do that, to be able to take that stance. I mean, that's actually a pretty remarkable thing, to have that awareness of what's the thing. I don't know, being ready for what you don't expect at the same time that welcoming or opening to it. That's a paradoxical, strange thing that's summarized very easily in that, what you just said, that Craic, like to get that idea, just, it's not an easy idea for people to get in life. But
yeah, I hope in Ireland we're not losing that. I mean, some of the kind of recent news headlines about intolerant responses to migrants and so on is a bit troubling.
Goodness, everywhere, but that would be another conversation. But it does remind me of the abyss or something, or different things in philosophy of that. Yeah, there's a lot of what we've already been discussing, and that we don't, this moment of not knowing yourself, and how in the way you described it just now, which I hope Ireland isn't losing to. I'm sure it's not. It'll come back to it. But that ability to be okay with not knowing yourself or something, like even to see it as a positive thing.
Yeah, and that's actually what O'Toole kind of plays on this phrase, we don't know ourselves, and says, actually allowing ourselves not to know ourselves and to be shaped and to continually find and refine ourselves is part of it. And I mean, this speaks directly to the questions around health, because there's a kind of adaptability. We talk about balance and metastability, and all of these ideas, I think, speak to this dual capacity for navigating agency through expressing some agency, but also, or navigating complexity, through expressing some agency, but also being continually responsive to what might emerge along the path. What is required to navigate complexity is this dual sensitivity, I think.
Does that have to do with awareness, cultivating awareness? You said you did a lot of practice early on, and I mean, to move, we don't have to move anywhere. I do want to talk about the shaping part and how you got from the patterns into the wayshaping, but it keeps making me think, like, what's the thing that's happening when we're noticing patterns and when we're learning to harmonize, or we're finding ways to do what we're saying here, be ourselves, and at the same time not really know ourselves and know that we don't know ourselves, and all of this stuff. And related to health, I think it's very important, because a lot of health issues, wherever you want to say, like in the body, traditionally physical, but also traditionally mental, it's about trying to think there is a way you're supposed to be, instead of that feeling of openness, or there's many different ways of being, and feeling a lot of stress that you don't fit in, or trying to fit in. And the same with the body, and the body, like taking a certain kind of medicine or having a certain prescription that's supposed to fit to the body, which, as if there's kind of one way of being a body. And yeah, I mean, you're kind of starting to open up that space.
I think that's a that's really profound. Maybe we can come back to the question about, well, maybe I'll go back to the story I was telling about health and so on, and circle back around to these things.
Yeah.
So this coordination disorder, and this kind of thing happened in Amsterdam. But this went on for years, and I didn't really understand it. And actually, it was the same woman who gave me the books that I talked about previously in that house at that time,
The
who
Chomsky.
I was chatting. Yeah, Chomsky, who I was chatting with at some point, and I think she maybe saw me in this kind of wobbly mode, and I had presumed this was just something that people experienced from time to time for years, and never really had confirmation otherwise. And she was like, "No, that's definitely not a normal thing. You should probably take that seriously." And
you just thought everyone had that or something. So you hadn't really you just went through it silently when it happened, more or less?
Yeah, I went through it silently for years. And maybe I expressed it to people in words that didn't really articulate what was going on for me. And never, I didn't convey it to the extent that somebody else recognized it not as part of their life and something particular to what was going on with me. For whatever reason, I guess I was inspired just knowing that to resolve it. So long story short, I became very interested in paying attention to how different things in my environment were interacting with my body. To the point where I became kind of obsessed and writing it down and trying to look at the time scales. And I did this at this time, and became kind of really attuned and developed a lot of sensitivity about how I was responding to certain situations or foods or even people, and started to get kind of better and better at positioning myself relative to things that were serving me and avoiding those that weren't. And within that, started to kind of grok onto this notion of habit as also serving this type of interest, right? So I could see how habits were unfolding in my kind of social constitution of my mind, but also that I could kind of, if I could gain control or somewhat steward or steer my habits or manage them in some way, that I could address some of these health issues that I was experiencing. And that I kind of just played around with in the background for years until relatively recently, where there was a situation in which suddenly kind of the value of life was presented as something not to take lightly, just a situation with a colleague who got quite sick. And a lot of us, I think, were forced into a reflection on what is it that we really want to be doing and focusing our time and attention on. And this particular interest in shaping habits for health behaviors and so on started to represent itself as the thing that maybe I should be focusing on. So since that time, I kind of redirected a lot of my research resources in that direction. And I've been lucky to be in OIST where I am and supported by Tom, because he's been very supportive of it.
So you've had some really cool people in your life to work with. I want to try to pull this stuff together because a lot of your work was relative to patterns of being together, and this goes into what you were just saying about what do we really want to do with our lives and thinking about health. And so all of this was together for you. It became your academic output in a sense, things you're writing about and giving to us. At the same time, you have your own life where you're literally sort of trying to negotiate and figure out which patterns lead to more, optimal isn't a very good word, but to you feeling the way that you want to feel in life, your health. Yeah. So how does it connect for you, I wonder, like when you think about the patterns of being together and the academic study that you've done? Because a lot of that is, we put it into academic language, but a lot of it is a similar search to the one when you're writing down all the details of your day and trying to find your health, I mean, in a way, we're trying to do it as individuals, but then in social groups, we're trying to find ways to think better and act better and so on. So have you thought much about all these connections in terms of the patterns of being together, and then now we'll move towards the shaping of those patterns?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, I would say, the kind of core of the effort that we're trying to articulate is to say, even if you are focusing as an individual on your own processes of change, you are always already invested in the mediation of change at other scales. There's a question about being both responsible towards that and the ethics that comes with that, and also like better leveraging those relationships, right? If I understand the extent to which I'm nested and helping comprise larger systems and comprised of smaller systems, and there is this kind of multi-scale competency architecture, as Mike Levin might talk about it. How can we engage with that architecture at different scales in service of the needs that we have and that we negotiate with ourselves and with each other? And, part of that is also to get back to the kind of language that we have and predominates around health of the individual. Again, just kind of like, kind of walls off the individual again to the, they might say, okay, there's this hierarchy of needs and everything, but actually it's a hierarchy of relations and flows and dynamics. It's not just that you as an individual person have these needs, it's that you are invested in these sets of relationships, and they also depend on you in certain ways. And, we can go into the specifics of any of this if you like, but I would definitely say that the approach we're trying to develop has this kind of sense of interdependence in the background. And there's a sense in which my hope is that when you practice the redirection of your own habits through the kinds of ideas that we're presenting and trying to articulate, that it is a practice in establishing a better sense of these relationships, right? So you may have came with this individual desire to just, I don't know, do this, make your, act more hastily towards your success, whatever you define that as. And in practicing through the tools we provide, the hope is that you cannot help but start to see these relationships and how you are both being served by them and serving them, and whether or not you're doing that well also becomes apparent. And I think there's a kind of ethics that emerges from the practice rather than saying upfront, here's the ethics of our practice. Although we might have that in the background of our design of the kind of approach, the ethics, we hope, kind of emerges from it. And it's not to say that it itself is some sort of value structure or set of values. I think you could take it and practice it within a set of values that me personally I'm not aligned with. But I do think there's something of a kind of bulwark against the kind of isolationist values that we tend to live in by default at this point in time.
Yeah, I think that's why I brought up that individual social, because it feels like there's a way in which we start to talk about just becoming aware of patterns in this way and linking it to habits. I'm not entirely sure how you connect patterns and habits necessarily. Maybe you have something to say about that, but it's all very connected, right? That our individual, the patterns we find ourselves within, the habits we create, and how those are always also creating social patterns and habits at ever more scales in all directions. And when we just think of something like philosophy, to go to kind of on your thesis, and you're speaking to a particular community, and in a sense you have this way in which you're doing what you do in your normal life, because you don't just choose radical embodied cognition or mind and life or the free energy side. I mean, you're in a way looking at all those different ways of being in this philosophical world, and you're saying, hey, look, it shares a lot of regularities, and we can, depending what we want from this, we don't necessarily have to choose one or the other. At the same time, we don't need to smush them all together and say everything goes. So there's a richness in that. And I'm trying to see if, so that's in a very social, big and specific space of philosophy. And your scholarship is great on that. And then now I feel like it's coming. So how do you've gone there, you've learned that, you've developed that skill for something similar to the way you developed in your life to be able to handle all those patterns and be okay with it, part of all those worlds. And in so doing, becoming a kind of resonance within them all. So now it feels like to me with Wayshaping, and I don't know, you keep saying us and our team, but I'm not sure who exactly that is, but you seem to have a community where you're trying to now take all this scholarship and everything you've spent so much time, because it's a lot of work, reading and knowing all of these things, thinking through them, writing. And then, I don't know if it happened when your friend got sick or what, but it's like, what am I really doing with this? And actually it does have there's something very practical might not be the right word, but we can use this to improve or help us get through our challenges on all these scales. Does that seem a little bit fair, what I just said? Is it a kind of bringing it into the realm of health at a different level now that you've gone through all the scholarship at that other level? Is it almost like a practice, like a behavioral practice? And
Yeah.
yeah.
No, that's exactly how I think about it. I mean, I think in a sense, although I express my interest is in ideas, growing up, my dad, another story, right? But growing up, my
Good.
dad was a fitter welder, and
What kind of welder?
that means so basically worked in a power plant. I don't know if you know anything about fitter welders, but they're a kind of interesting group. They have a certain type of magic. They basically tend to say any of the machines, but also the structural dimensions of a plant, let's say. So I think what's interesting about them is that everything is available for refashioning and remodeling, right?
Huh.
So fitter welders are notorious for like building tools out of other tools, and you see their toolbox and it's all tools welded together because
Mm,
they had to fashion something on the fly for a very particular job that was only ever happened once, kind of.
great. So he's thinking across categories too, like what of this could make this work and so on in terms of the mechanics. That's cool.
Exactly. Exactly. My dad brought home some of that interest at some point to make extra money, and we started a kind of crafts business. And as part of that, we were doing kind of sculpture, but it was always very practical. It was always very pragmatic. Candlesticks or lamps or staircases or, chairs or things like that. And yeah, I was obsessed with it. Something I did for a long time. I guess was my original artistic kind of expression.
Wow, that's
Um,
super cool. Makes sense too, because it's also about seeing things from different perspectives and, like not just thinking because it's been called a chair and people have only sat in it that that's all it does or something. I mean, there's a lot of connection here I see between
yeah.
all the. Mhm.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And
So,
the sense was, I think, this possibility of recombination, but towards a particular end. There was always a sense of, oh, it's practical, right? We can justify it because it serves some end. And I mean, in a sense, that made sense in the place where I grew up, surrounded by construction workers and agriculturists, and these are the
mhm.
kinds of things. These were our customers at the time too.
So your dad was doing that. He was doing what I described in a way, sort of, but in real, in a factory.
Yeah, so he was working in a power station, but we were doing this kind of more artistic endeavor
Yeah,
at
yeah.
home. And
I understood
yeah,
that. I was just
okay.
trying to figure out how it relates to your work in philosophy and now your shift to the
Yeah, yeah, sorry.
similar, yeah. Both of those,
Yeah,
the
so
art at home and the work that he was doing. It's, yeah, anyway.
I I think part of me has always had this kind of teleos towards the practical, so even when I was doing my PhD work, it was to help me understand my relationships to the people around me. There was something very practical about it, and to be able to communicate to others and maybe mitigate some of the tensions that arise because of conflicting norms and that kind of thing. The philosophy I've done has always been channeled in the direction of something quite. I mean, you said pragmatic, but I like that term. I think there's a kind of pragmatism to what I do.
I like it too. It just sometimes has different connotations for different people. Some people,
Sure.
integrated might be better, or, there's a lot of different ways of, yeah. But I guess what we mean is it's your life and your work are not separate, which it feels like a lot in academia. So this is
Yeah.
for those who aren't in academia, this might feel very familiar, but if you're in academia, it often, especially if you're in some kind of specialized neuroscience something or cognitive science, you can feel like everything you're doing all day, you can't even explain to normal people because they wouldn't, not that they
Yeah.
couldn't understand it, but they would have to take time to read a million books and know all this special language and references and so on. And you just start, it can feel very isolating, And I guess what I'm hearing you say is your work has always been practical and integrated in the sense of it still relates to the life that is shared across kind of disciplines or different groups of people. But this way shaping really brings it home in a different way for me. I mean, it's,
No, I think that's true. Yeah, I think that's the effort in some sense. So if it feels like that, that's good, right? And there's a sense in which I'm, you know, like we said earlier, when you're looking for coincidences in the world and you respond to your own excitement, when you say something like that, I feel excited because it's like, okay, this is on the right track. And people do respond to it in a way that maybe they don't to some of the more abstract stuff, and certainly some of the ideas I might be interested in, but don't so much work on.
Yeah, I feel like you're still all finding the language and the way to express it, but it's there. I mean, the way making part, we don't want to talk about that's part of it because people hear enough about way making probably, but in that sense, I understand because it's about all these different levels that we've been talking about. It's health and many different kinds of landscapes depending on which patterns you have in those and looking at them and so on. And then there's the wayfinding, which you might want to talk about, which is wonderful scholarship that I'm just discovering recently. And then the shaping part too. To close, we can touch on the way and the shaping of wayshaping, which is what you're working on now, and there'll be more to come. But I guess to lead into that, we've been talking about patterns a lot. Are you trying to help people learn what their patterns and habits are and to understand them almost in this musical or dancing or continuous sense and reorient? Is that the kind of practice that you're really developing with things like the seed habit you talk about and self-scaffolding? There's some real terms there. I don't know what to compare it to. I mean, logotherapy or something, but there's a way in which there's a philosophy and there's a practice emerging out of it. Is that fair? I'm just setting it up for you to say whatever you want, but that's how having just looked at it, it feels like that.
I think that in a sense, we're still figuring it out. And so when I say there is actually a team, so I should name them. So Tom is part of this in the background somewhere. Also, Mushfiqa Jamaluddin, Aisha Belhadi, and Dave Snowden is also a collaborator from afar a little bit. But actually, this work is kind of also framed by a broader framing in what we call multiscale health. We're doing that work with Fernando Rosas and Michelle Mays and John Sykes and Michael Levin and Tom as well. And there we're trying to look at how misalignments across scales, both spatial, let's say domains or spatial and temporal, or disorders are characteristics of these misalignments or characterized by these types of misalignments. And within that context, if it's, let's say, okay, broad strokes, if it's true that disorder is characterized by misalignment, well, then prevention of disorder or restoration towards health requires some sort of, say, realignment, let's say, broadly speaking. And the primary, say, means by which an individual can serve their own realignment is through the kind of shaping of their own patterns so as to situate themselves in the world relative to flows that serve their needs, right? So, like, what is a habit? In a sense, it's the means by which you couple to a regular flow in your environment, right? And ideally, that should serve your needs. And to the extent that you can orchestrate or shape or architect or design your habits in ways that does that over some period of time relative to different needs, right, you're better able to kind of, let's say, maintain this kind of sense of health and adaptivity and resilience that we kind of gestured towards.
And what I love too is that it's not, you say realignment. I just want to stop for a minute because it almost sounds like there's one alignment that's right and you got to get into it. But you do talk about Dewey, as I brought up, and about not thinking linearly about habits and not thinking that there's just one kind of alignment, or that maybe you are saying, but you and your team are going to help people align and then they're just going to be aligned and everything is, it's not that kind of a alignment, is it? I don't know.
No, so we have a kind of working definition of health as advantageous alignment relative to negotiated needs, right? So it's a dynamic alignment that shifts around given both your available resources. So that's bodily, environmental, interpersonal, and the kinds of demands and needs that you have. So it's and say within a given system, you might have some dimension of the system that's healthy and another dimension that's not, let's say, and needs realignment. So and again, that realignment is going to be contextual. So it's trying to take all of this kind of interscalar, multiscale understanding and leverage it in some sort of service of how we kind of understand how things kind of go wrong in some sense and lead to disorders of different types, whether those are kind of the obstructional type, right? There's something in the path that I can't get around, or I just can't see the path because it's a bit obfuscated or a bit ambivalent. In a sense, right, you could think of those as the types of challenges we run into with our, let's say, mental health, often are characterized in those terms, right? There's something stuck or there's something that I can't find or make my way towards.
Mm-hmm.
The general multiscale health framing looks at how different types of disorders at different scales have similar characteristics, and how if we just, in some sense, can maintain certain types of dynamics within these systems that tend to orient around health, and the way-shaping stuff acts in service of that. Now, this is all, let me say, not validated work, right? This is like
No, it's early stages, but
early
there's a
stages.
lot of work behind it already. I mean, a lot of the scholarship that you're coming out of has long trajectories. You mentioned a lot of it already, and how you're going to articulate all this is still coming up.
Yeah. That's kind of where we're at. I mean, we have like elements of, let's say, the practice. We have some of the kind of theory and organizing principles. And then, there's a lot of effort to put it in language that actually works with people and clients. So, some of the collaborators earlier are actually psychiatrists and organizational designers and coaches, and working with clients and trying to put this in a language that resonates with them. And they don't have to understand everything that kind of exists in the background, but our hope is that when people are informed by this language, that it's both more effective in some regard, but also like that there is a kind of, in engaging with this kind of scaffolding in service of your own change, you also start to incorporate the scaffolding, and with time just start to become a way maker, way shaper, way finder that's more in tune with the kinds of needs that you wish to express within.
That's beautifully said. Yeah. I think it's very, there's a reason a lot of us use these, Michael and Tim and me and so many people, like the idea of the way and these landscapes, and it helps us to be able to understand. I guess some of the most positive feedback I've gotten has been from people more trying to find a way to articulate what they're going through in terms of some kind of individual or so-called traditionally mental complication, and just being able to think of it as where you can understand there's not just one landscape, but you can understand it as landscapes and all that you bring with you. So you think of it as a trajectory, and that it's not only yours. I like that multi-scale alignment, and thinking of all that has gone into your path and is still going on. It's alive, it's this phenomenology that you talk about a lot, the embodied lived experience. It is a practice, right? And this feeling of what I think you're really, from what I've read, you're not like trying to pin things down, but keep it this live, lived experience, dynamic, while at the same time having these markers. So yeah, you're still working on it, but it's great that you have a good group of people and that you have that vision and that you have all this input. I find it very exciting.
Oh, thank you.
And I wonder how it's affected your own life. Have you been, because we learn what we teach what we learn, and as we're creating papers, and you're creating this now with all these people, and I wonder, is it changing your own patterns and habits? Is it continuous from what we've been describing about when you were taking the notes and dealing with your health and all that? Do you see this as part of that flow for you, or how's that?
It's, I mean, maybe not as much as it should, but I think,
good to be honest.
I think there's, so maybe a skill that I think has emerged for me in this, that I can acknowledge and recognize, is a kind of ability to things move through me in a way that's helpful. So I don't know what you would call that, but it feels like a kind of aikido with the world, right?
Love, you said? Did you say
Sorry?
love? Because I was just about to ask you about love, and so I heard you say the word love, but did you really say the word love?
I didn't, but it's in that direction.
I was about to ask, I don't know what you think love is, because I was about to ask you, I was thinking, but it's a kind of a keto with the world, because I was trying to relate this. I wanted to ask you about your own practice. You can please continue, but also just yeah, this love and philosophy is the name of this, and I can't help but always introduce that word at some point. We've already been talking about it, but keep going, please, with the Aikido. What were you saying was the Aikido with the world? I heard love, but what did you say?
I'm actually glad you brought that up, because I do think this is where this connects. I think
Okay.
this is exactly. So whatever that kind of a stance towards the world is, or towards yourself, or towards the situation, where you both say respect your kind of agency and trajectory, but also stay sensitive to the possibility both that you might have been wrong, or that there's something else might emerge
You
that
don't know yourself, or what's the phrase? We don't know ourselves. Yeah.
you know ourselves. Yeah. I think so. As in the practice, we do kind of gesture in the direction of the idea that, let's say, as a practitioner, whether it's you engaged in the practice yourself or serving somebody else as a kind of facilitator, that the stance is one of a kind of engaged letting be. So there's a German term, Gelassenheit, I think I pronounced somewhat
Sounds good.
right.
Mhm.
this this is, so it means engaged letting be, but I don't know if you know Hannah D. Ager's work. She
Sure.
has this, she talks about the nature of the relationship between knowing and loving. And she talks about knowing in a kind of way that, like, knowing well, that's is a kind of loving, right? And what that entails is a kind of letting be, right? I'm present to the thing. I'm kind of there as the scaffolding it needs, if it needs it, but I'm also letting it do what it needs to do and express its own autonomy and agency and individuality. And and she uses the example of romantic love as a way to attune ourselves to that type of stance towards the other or towards the world. I also think, parent, I'm not a parent, but I expect parenting can be in its finer moments very much like that, where there's neither desire to over determine or under determine the other, right? But let them kind of unfold and present themselves to you. And I do think that is, so when I first encountered Hannah's work, I could see this from a contemplative standpoint as some set of skills I might want to develop. And there's something to that. I do think there's a kind of possibility of refining those skills. Um, and I think our work is somehow in this mix of the types of skills that are refined therein. But I think she's right. My experience of what it means to love, I think, is very much aligned with this engaged stance of letting be. Yeah, I think maybe, that extends not just to, the other, right? But the parts of ourselves that maybe require or deserve that. And, when I think about wayshaping as this kind of engagement with ourselves and our environment, and trying to understand the relationships, and like what is open for change and what is not, and what is resistant to change, and how, given the available resources in our environment, we might say nourish or resource ourselves in the direction of some desirable outcome, such that we are getting our needs met in more regular ways. That really does feel like expressing a love towards myself. And if we include others as part of that, there is going to be a negotiation there. So it is going to be a set of negotiated needs that we are orienting towards, and, kind of refiguring and reconstituting and relearning as we move towards them, because there's always novelty kind of entering upon that relationship too.
That's really beautiful. It makes me think of intention and action, which we didn't talk about, but comes in a lot. This idea, I think you say in some of the early writing about way shaping, that we are not, the things we care about, we don't actually often care for or take care of, is what you mean. I think it's like this, what we really care about, we don't actually end up spending the time and energy to kind of take care of it.
Yeah, well, this is something Monica speaks about a lot, the idea that we don't often care for the things we care about, and that trying to bring some sort of alignment between those two things is often very challenging. In more traditional psychological terms, we might say there's a discrepancy between our intention and our action. And then we beat ourselves up over the fact that I just can't realize this intention. What is it about me in particular, right? That I can't realize
Mm.
I'm such an idiot or whatever, and we're hard on ourselves. But actually, in this kind of embodied approach, right, first of all, acknowledge that in some sense our intentions are distributed through our environment. So is our environment set up in service of those intentions already? And if it's not, I mean, we're really kind of working against the energy gradients that already exist there.
So wonderful. Yeah, I have to stop that in just a minute because we do think that there's our intentions, but just to go back to even where we started with, even with our conversation we had on your podcast, like we are different people in different situations, and the intention and the action changes too. So it's beautiful that you just, it can seem so simple, but to realize that what's the setting that you're putting yourself in, and what inner trajectory are you bringing to that, and all of this, just to have some way to think about that. It's so important.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, what we're trying to do is develop a language to think about that, right?
Yeah, because it's hard. It seems simple, like a simple act, but it changes so much, and it's actually so nuanced, and that gets to the practice too, because you don't just do it once and then it's done. It's like kind of you learn. It almost becomes a habit or a pattern at the same time that it's coupled with awareness and presence. It's not just that you're taking it for granted, and we're still all trying to figure out how to put language on that, and that's part of what we're all trying to do, I guess, with this stuff.
Yeah. I'm glad that some of it is landing, at least. That makes me happy.
Yeah, it is. And yeah, I think it's what we need to be thinking about and doing, and bringing it together in the sense that you're trying to do. So I'm
Yeah,
glad you're
and
doing
there's,
it.
I mean, we termed the framework for the time being, at least, Wayshaping, in no small part inspired by your work. So thank you very much for the broader framing here. I really do see this as a kind of a kind of manifestation of waymaking in some ways, and maybe the attempt to distill some of that into a practice of sorts. When we bring intention to our waymaking and we add some sort of a shaping element to it, we can navigate the kinds of trajectories that we might want to more intentionally, I would say. Yeah, I do think like some of it seems so obvious, right, when you say it, but it's like, but it wasn't obvious until it was said in a particular way. And I feel like there's a lot of that kind of thing emerging in this work and surrounding work. And like one thing we're thinking about a lot recently is if you think about this multiscalar health idea, and what's necessary. If you have all these scales and domains, what's necessary, or at least one dimension of that, is like adequate and distributed communication across those scales, right? If you don't get that, you don't have the ability to coordinate in a way that serves the body and identity, let's say, and personality and everything. One thing we've been thinking about is how all disorder is in some sense a manifestation of too fast, too slow, too much, or too little. Right? There's a scale at which something is happening, and the other scales cannot absorb or accommodate or metabolize whatever has been, say, produced from that higher or lower scale, that results in some sort of disruption and tension and something that needs to be resolved. That to me has been so helpful recently, but I never put it in those terms before. And then once I did, it started to kind of make sense.
I wrote this master. It's more hippocampus based, but it's more or less how to understand thinking as waymaking. But I don't use the term, but I use like navigability because I'm thinking about the hippocampus. And I worked with this lab, Georg Nordhoff, who has this whole thing about temporospatial neuroscience, which, I mean, yes, it can go a little kind of into the ether, but what you just said is what drew me to that, is really thinking of understanding, because a lot of my motivation for doing a neuroscience degree was literally that I wanted to understand people I saw in pain, from mental health, physical, bodily, and it really motivated me to want to study it in the sense that you were motivated. I mean, it came out of this real life thing. And a lot of it is exactly what you said. It's once you start to look, someone's living in a slower space or a faster space. There's just the alignment issue. Not only in the embodied experience is somehow something is different there, and they're trying to fit into some kind of setting. You talk about setting and place a lot. We don't have time to get into it, but those themselves can be like the kind of containers through which we grow and change. When these people are experiencing this pain and discomfort, often it's the misalignment with those settings and their own settings. It helped me
Yes.
a lot to think of it like that. And you can see it in the research too in neuroscience and in other sciences, but
Yeah,
yeah.
no, I really do think it's a kind of a unifying vocabulary that's, well, you have to be dangerous or you have to be careful with unifying vocabularies, but like sets of ideas and principles that are, yet to be extracted or made sense of or refined that will help us think about these things so much better. And I'm excited for that. You know, I think it takes to most of us most of the time have good intentions. It's hard to
Yeah.
realize them.
Yeah, it's how
So
to
like
act
if we
together to help each other. Because often we're also doing similar things, but we're calling it different words, or we feel like we need to be in competition, like, coin this or do this, or instead of, oh, actually, we're all doing this together.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I
But
agree with that entirely. Yeah.
but I think that's why I like this framework because it can incorporate a lot of people who are doing things similar. It's just trying to find this practical level of what to do with it. It's a lot of work, but I think yeah, I don't know. I'm just saying thank you for doing it, and I wish you a lot of luck with it. And I'm here to help anyway. I've thought a lot about the practice of waymaking too, so at some point I should look back at all that writing. It's from a while ago and see if any of it even, maybe it connects somehow. I don't know.
No, it'd be awesome to meet. Well, actually, I'm in Europe soon. I don't know if I have the chance to meet up, but it would be awesome for us and people who are similarly interested, maybe to organize something around this and
Yeah.
sit down, talk ourselves away, or open ourselves up, or whatever we have to do. But kind of see where this whole thing is at and
I
where it
think that's
wants
a
to go.
good. As I was reading your work too, I was thinking there could be some kind of I don't know what, like a colloquium or a club or a forum or some way of sharing
Yeah.
among all these people. I guess in a way I'm trying to do that with this. That's what this all started as, but I meant it more specific for or what you're trying to do. Because yeah, it feels like it has important, practical, and something that needs to be done right now in terms of helping us find our way, make our way, shape our way, reorient. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you want? I just realized it's been like a couple hours and it's getting dark there, so I don't want to, you need to have your evening, but is there anything we haven't talked about that, is kind of on your mind that you would like to say, or just anything that pops into your mind?
I mean, I think we could keep talking, but what's pressing?
Or we can keep going, but
There's a lot of technical things and everything I would love to share with you at some point, but maybe they're
mhm.
not that interesting at the moment.
Yeah, we can always talk again about other stuff, but it's just nice to connect with you again. And I guess the last question is, are there any patterns or habits that and you don't even have to answer this question, but I thought of it a few times as we were talking. Like, I wonder how hard it is for you to change your patterns and habits and to realign and to keep in mind this dynamic lived experience as not static. I mean, one thing I struggle, or I think we all kind of struggle with, is mistaking the map and territory or whatever. And
Yeah.
yeah, understanding, keeping in your whitehead kind of mindset, or that this is a process, and even as we study it and create these practices, they will all of that will still be changing. I just
Yeah.
wonder how hard is it for you in your own experience of patterns and habits to kind of reorient or realign or think of it.
Yeah.
Has it become easier doing this?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm kind of like proud to say yes, and I do use some of these ideas and the intuitions that I've derived from them. I think it's always surprising me, and there's always blind spots. I don't think we're ever going to capture the full complexity of how we make our way. I kind of, it would be boring if we could just shape ourselves perfectly in line with whatever intention, all the kind of mystery and surprise and crack was gone out of it. But
Hmm.
definitely, I've become better at being able to situate myself relative to the kinds of flows that are serving my needs. And, there's a sense in which over time, the feeling of needing to change in a given direction has definitely lessened because I guess I am maybe feeling more rooted at whatever those sources are, and I'm returning to them often enough that the kind of frequency and amplitude of throughput is met in some way that does satisfy my present needs. But yeah, there's still challenges. I'm trying to like make my way within academia and shape my way within academia at the present. And we're trying to, me and my partner, trying to find a place that we can be together. She's in the States at the moment, and
Oh, wow. That's pretty far
that's
away.
challenging. Some of these come in useful, but also, they have their limits, and I'm finding my limits there at the moment.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, maybe it's time that those ways will form another way. I mean, it's like we were saying at the beginning, once you start getting kind of clear on the patterns that you resonate with, you start to see more of those patterns, and those paths do start to open. And it's not mystical or anything. It's just that's what's
yeah,
happening, and that's what we're trying to understand. So, yeah, as someone
yeah,
who's had a lot of long-term, far distant relationships, but recently kind of did what you're saying. I settled and came together in one place. When it's time, it really works well. So yeah, I'm sure it'll happen in the right way. My dog is needing to go out, I think. Yeah, Mark,
Got a dog.
yeah, go ahead.
I was just asking, who's your dog?
This is my dog, Holly. Want to come say hi, Holly? She's been trying to jump on my. Oh, guess where she's from?
I'm gonna
Mongolia.
say Ireland.
Here's Holly. Hello. Hi, hi, hi,
Hello.
hi, 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 hi. She's from Mongolia.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Monkey.
I saw your cat walking around in the back. Ah, you have to say something so it comes on my camera. Oh,
She didn't say.
oh. Other beings making way are important. They help us.
Yeah, and there's, I mean, the frames we talked about earlier, they are present in those interspecies relationships too.
Absolutely.
Patterns have that I rely on and she relies on and expect to be present, and if they're not there, there's something wrong.
Yeah, so true. I often think of that a lot in the way, like walking the dog and stuff, the way that she makes her way and all these patterns that it changes the way I see the world and make my way. And the reason I asked you about the patterns and stuff being hard for you is because I feel like we're getting to a point where we're trying to really live our
Mm.
work in a sense, or in the way all we've been talking, all this creation of this philosophy, or not even bringing this montage together into a framework and articulating, clarifying, it changes your whole way of being in the world, And yeah, in the same way we've been talking about, you can't really distinguish all these beginnings and ends anymore. And it does get hard with academia of where's the right space to be living in that kind of experience in that world.
Yeah, yeah. I think I will, professionally speaking, I think this stuff might struggle to find a home because the boundaries aren't so easily defined. And when I look at the existing space of behavioral science, there's a certain rigidity to it and a certain aesthetic and a set of affectations that accompany it that, almost at times seem antithetical to it. And that's not to say, or antithetical to some of the work that we're trying to do, but that's not to say there's not good work there. I think there's a lot of good work there. I just think we have our critiques of that, and I think they're pretty robust critiques, and I'd be happy to talk about them at some future point. But I think the critique is it's helpful, but it's kind of limited, and not acknowledging those limitations and pushing through, I think, can be destructive, and hopefully not too destructive before we figure out how to reorient again. But
No, I agree. And I do think there's a lot of people in academia who are trying to do that. I think it's shifting. And a lot of when I think of different theories and practices that I would kind of connect somewhat in the tradition of where wayshaping is going, that they've made a huge difference and they weren't all really easily accepted in academia at the beginning. So there's some worth in being in academia and trying to, having your ideas tested, being with this group who's really thinking critically, and at the same time being able to hold those other spaces like we talked about at the beginning where maybe this is going to have its first resonance in different areas that aren't traditionally kind of fitting into that academic trajectory, but at the same time, you still respect it all and let it be.
yeah,
And I think it also helps to shift academia too and what people want and what they do from it. So, all to say, I'm very grateful that you're doing all this, and I look forward to talking about it more and hearing more as it develops.
yeah, thank you for having me on. I've really enjoyed this. I said before we came on that I was kind of excited to have this conversation because it felt like I was going into a kind of safe space and it was going to be comfortable, and chill and good chat, and I feel like it has been all of those things. So I appreciate making that space.
Well, thanks for being here. I think you've shared a lot that I definitely will take with me, and I think other people will too. That is really helpful. And thank you for being open and sharing that stuff. It really makes a difference. I can tell you just from hearing some people who write, and there's one little thing that someone shares that no one's ever heard anyone else share before, and it might even seem small to other people, but to that one person, it does open them to a path they needed to open to. So I feel like you've done that. Who knows in what way, but thanks anyway, however you've done it. And have a good night there. Do something nice, I guess. But now it must be almost 8 or something.
It's
7.
4:15.
Okay. All right. Well, have a good evening. Bye to the cat and bye to the cat.